Okay, go ahead.
Okay, fine. All right, this week is Parshas Teitzei, and also we is the second week of Chodesh Elul, and I just want to point out certain similarities between the idea that perhaps the idea of Chodesh Elul, and if we have time to connect it to Parshas Teitzei. And I'm going to start off by mentioning something that I discussed in my shul this past Shabbos. The custom is that in Chodesh Elul, at the end of Shachris, before, and some do it after, we say L'David Hashem Ori, we blow the shofar. The Lithuanian minhag was to blow the shofar after L'David Hashem Ori. The predominant custom is to blow the shofar before L'David Hashem Ori. Whatever it is, but at the completion of Shachris, a L'David Hashem Ori is said. And the Ramah mentions that there was a custom in his time to blow the shofar, not just at the end of Shachris, but in the evening also, after Ma'ariv. And the question is, we know on Rosh Hashanah, the mitzvah of shofar is only in the day. It's not at night. It's true. In Elul, it's not based on a mitzvah. It's all based on a custom. But one would think that the mitzvah of shofar would serve as the blueprint in terms of the time for the blowing of the shofar during Chodesh Elul, during the month of Elul. And we have to understand, why is it that the custom developed to blow the shofar during Chodesh Elul? Many say it's because it's a month before the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. Tiku b'chodesh shofar, b'kesla yom chagenu. The idea of shofar is identified in the prophets with a month. A month probably represents the idea of preparation. But the more predominant reason given is based on the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. The Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says that the Chachamim, that the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai to receive the second Luchos, it was actually the third time that Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai. The first time he went up to get the first Luchos. But then he went up a second time to be mispalel to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to accept, to give the Jewish people another chance. And then he went up a third time to receive the second set of Luchos, the Ten Commandments, the tablets of the Ten Commandments. And when Moshe Rabbeinu went up, so they blew the shofar. The Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says they blew the shofar in order for the Jewish people not to commit the same blunder they made the first time. When Moshe Rabbeinu, who was gone for 40 days, the people decided to pressure Aaron to build a golden calf. And just 40 days after they said Nasa v'Nishma, 40 days after they accepted the Torah, 40 days after what our sages tell us, they were on a level higher than angels. They stood in front of a golden calf and said, Elul Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel. And there was a fear and a concern that they might commit the same blunder. And in order to prevent them from committing the same blunder, when Moshe Rabbeinu went up the final time to receive the Luchos Shnios, to get the Ten Commandments engraven on the tablets of stone. So they blew the shofar, and somehow the blowing of the shofar had the function and the purpose of preventing the Jewish people from building another golden calf. We have to understand that. How are we to understand it? How did the shofar prevent the Jewish people from recommitting that same blunder? And we also have to understand, how is it possible that the Jewish people, 40 days after saying Nasav and Ishma, 40 days after being so close to God, could stand in front of a golden calf and say, Elul Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, O Israel. And we find something similar, certainly not exactly the same, when the Meraglim, the spies, who themselves were leaders of the Jewish people, who at the time that they were sent out on their mission by Moshe Rabbeinu to search out the land of Canaan and to give back a report that it was hoped would encourage the Jewish people to go and take and conquer the land that was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then instead of bringing back a positive report, they said, Tov Aretz Mod Mod, there's no question that the land is a very beautiful land. Its agriculture is superb. But Ephes, however, we will never be able to conquer it. And because of this report, the Jewish people had to spend 40 years in the desert for the generation of the desert to die out before they were able to enter Israel and before they were able to enter the land of Israel. How is it possible that the leaders of the Jewish people, who our sages tell us that at the time they embarked on their mission, were Anoshim Tzadikim, were righteous people, 40 days later, they lead a rebellion, not just against Moshe, but against HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself? How we to understand it? But, and I've mentioned many times, that in the Haggadah on Pesach, we say, Yilu kirvanu lifnei har Sinai v'lo nasan lanu es Torah dayenu. If you, God, brought us close at Mount Sinai and didn't give us the Torah, that in itself would have been very great. We enumerate many of the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did on behalf of the Jewish people. And to stress the obligation that we have to show our appreciation and to express our thanks. to him. And we say, Elul Kervanu Lefnei Har Sinai, if you brought us close at Mount Sinai and didn't give us the Torah, that in itself would have been special. What would have been so special about standing at Mount Sinai? A mountain that was not superior in its appearance or in its height or in any of its physical features to the other mountains of the area. What would have been significant about being at Mount Sinai if we didn't get the Torah? And I think the explanation is, Elul Kervanu Lefnei Har Sinai doesn't mean you brought us close to Mount Sinai, but you brought us close to you. Keraftanu, you brought us close. There was revelation in Mount Sinai, in addition to the Torah. My father and my uncle used to talk about the experience of Sinai, in addition to the mitzvos of Sinai. My uncle would call it the kolos ubrakim of Har Sinai. My father would call it the fire of Sinai. And it was all of that, but it was much more than all of that. I think the experience of Har Sinai was revelation, the nature of the revelation. Sensing the presence of God. And at Mount Sinai, the Jews also received the Torah. And just as we're required to perpetuate the Torah of Sinai, we are required to perpetuate the experience of Sinai. And the essence of the experience of Sinai is sensing the presence of God. And in a sense, that was part of the purpose of the Mishkan, part of the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash, to have a place that was the perpetuation of Sinai. Of course, the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan were not just the perpetuation of the experience of Har Sinai, that sense of closeness, that place that was set aside to give karbanos, that comes from the word karo, coming close to God, feeling his presence. The Rambam says it's not from the Mikdash that you have to have fear and awe, but from one whose presence was there, for the presence of God Almighty. So the Jewish people are required to perpetuate, together with the Torah of Sinai, the experience of Sinai. But it's not just two different obligations. The two go hand in hand. If a person is not able to perpetuate the experience of Sinai, he will not be able to perpetuate the Torah of Sinai. He won't be able to perpetuate it, certainly halachically, from a perspective of Limud Torah. Kol mi she'ein lo ela Torah, afilu Torah ein lo. Whoever has only Torah, even Torah he doesn't have. But even from the fulfillment of the mitzvahs of the Torah, he will be unsuccessful if he is not able to perpetuate the experience of Sinai. It's interesting, the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, when he discusses about a person who realizes not on Yom Kippur and not on Rosh Hashanah, but on any day of the year, I made a sin. I want to do tshuva. I want to repent. What does he say? Ana Hashem. Please, God. Chatasi yavisi pashati lefanecha. I sinned in 3 different possible forms. Lefanecha, before you. And I'm embarrassed about it, and I won't do it again. That's the admission prayer, the vidui prayer, that someone who recognizes that he sins says when he wants to change his ways. And he says, Vasisi kach v'kach, I did such and such, and I won't return to it again. I regret it. I'm ashamed about it. But he says, Ana Hashem, please God, Chatasi avisi pashati, I sinned before you. What do you mean I sinned before you? Just say I sinned. Why is there an emphasis on I sinned before you? But when we do tshuva, we have to evaluate ourselves, to analyze ourselves. We have to become our own psychologists. We have to understand ourselves. How did I come to sin? Matter of fact, the beginning of this week's Sedra, Chazal tell us that Aveira Goreris Aveira. First, there's Yefas Toar. The Torah talks about a person who is out at war, and he's overcome by the beauty, the physical beauty of a lady from one of the other nations. And there are certain things that the Torah permits under certain circumstances, not because it was proper, but because of a realization, Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzer Hara, recognizing that sometimes when one is involved in war, he doesn't act properly. And that causes the person, in those days, you were allowed to have more than one wife. I'll have 2 wives, and one wife will be hated. That's another sin. And he will not treat the children of the hated wife properly. That's another sin. And then a child will become a delinquent, a ben sorel moreh. That's another sin. It's a question. We start off with Yefas Toar, something that the Torah permitted to him under those circumstances. So why is that identified with a sin? But sometimes things that are permitted, you shouldn't do anyway. You shouldn't want to do it. And if you do give in, to the drives of the situation, then you're embarking on a path of sin. Even though legally the first step on that path was not legally sinful. But psychologically, emotionally, it was simple. Avera goreres avera. One sin causes another sin. And then the final question. But the final sin is a child who becomes a delinquent, who's a ben sora mora. It's a different person. But we have responsibilities for our deeds. Not only for the sin that we did, but for causing other sins. And sometimes, even if it's the sin of other people, we bear certain responsibility. So, the Jewish people at the time of, why is all of that? That's the challenge of war. The challenge of war is that sometimes we enter a different milieu, a different situation. When we're in a situation where we go to shul, we daven, we go to learn, we study. We became accustomed to the mitzvahs of the Torah. But all of that could crumble when we change the milieu. And in a sense, and I've mentioned this many times, this is the challenge of Jewish education today. Because in previous times, there was greater stability of life. Usually, people lived in the same towns, in the same area where their ancestors lived. Surrounded by their relatives. And of course, there were all kinds of changes taking place in the outside world, although at a much slower pace than they're taking place today. Look how much our culture has changed in the last 5 years. In the last 2 years. Things that people couldn't believe. Today, those same people are advocates for it. But whatever it is, when Jews lived in their small towns, they had their own communities. Of course, there was an effect. But today, you can lock yourself up in any place you want. Let it be Williamsburg, let it be Lakewood, let it be Muncie. We are part of the outside society. We can fool ourselves. So we have to be able, and not only that, one generation can move to a community and will say, oh, I'm protected spiritually. But maybe you are protected. But don't believe that your children and your children's children will face the same situation. They will face challenges. that will certainly force many of them to go somewhere else. Besides the challenges of the changing culture of the outside society that will creep into whatever city we'll be living in. So Jewish education has to build people up to be able to overcome these influences of the Yetzer Hara, these influences that are destroying society today and destroying many of our own families as well. And certainly, when you have war, when you have epidemics, as we saw previously, how that affected our society. I know of many people who have become accustomed not to go to shul. They used to come every Shabbos, some of them every day. But that's the nature of assimilation. Assimilation is not just going to a university, as some people would like to believe. We get used to things. Sometimes it's good things, sometimes it's bad things. But it all has an effect on us. And certainly going into a battlefield in a war situation, that has an effect on us as well. So, and the Jewish people, who you have to remember, just left Egypt. They were slaves. And who was their leader in Egypt? Paro. And all of a sudden, Moshe Rabbeinu replaces Paro. And in a sense, their attitude towards Moshe Rabbeinu, and perhaps to a certain degree towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is one of a servile attitude. I once suggested in the tefillin of Rabbeinu Tam, but it's dependent on all different ways of understanding Rabbeinu Tam. There's big machlokas rishonim, how to understand Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. But Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin has Kadesh v'haya k'biyacha v'haya im shemoa and shema. In other words, not in the order of the Torah. And the question is, why did Rabbeinu Tam, the Rishonim already asked that question, feel? Okay, from the Lashon of the Gemara Menachos, it appears like Rabbeinu Tam, as Tosfos points out. But what is the logic for it? And there's a number of answers, and each answer, I think, is dependent on how you understand Rabbeinu Tam's opinion. But one possible answer we could suggest is that the Jewish people received the mitzvah of tefillin in Egypt. Before the Torah, the different parshios of the Torah were put together. And according to some Rishonim, and Shema V'hayim Shemoa, that was put into the Torah at the end of Chumash Dvarim. So it could be that when the four parshios were revealed in Mitzrayim, if we say that four parshios were revealed in Mitzrayim, there is a machlokus about that also. It could be, according to Rabbeinu Tam, V'hayim Shemoa came before Shema. And that's why, in the order of the tefillin, you have Kadesh, V'haya Kivyacha, V'hayim Shemoah Shema. Why did V'hayim Shemoah come before Shema at that time? But later, in the Torah, Shema comes before V'hayim Shemoah. The answer is Shema. There's a difference between the relationship with God, as it's described in Shema, and the relationship with God is described in the Parsha of V'hayim Shemoah. In Shema, we accept the yoke of heaven, and we speak of loving God with all our hearts and everything we have. There's no talk of reward and punishment. In V'hayim Shemoah, we're warned, if we'll be loyal to God, if we will do the mitzvos, things will be good for us. There will be rain for our crop, and everything will go well. But Hishamru Lachem, but if you deviate from the way of God, and you serve idols, so there will be punishment after punishment. We are both the servants of God and the children of God. But you have to focus on that parent-child relationship. V'hayim Shemoah emphasizes, it's not that the other relationship isn't mentioned, but it emphasizes the master servant relationship, and even not the highest level of it. A servant, he knows his next meal comes from his master. And if he won't do his work, if he won't fulfill his obligations, it will not be good for him. The Jewish people, when they left Egypt, they saw themselves not so much as children of God, but God replaced Paro, and they became his servants. Of course, they were treated altogether differently. And to a certain degree, without the whip, without Paro's whip. So as we say, a slave knows he has to work, because otherwise he's going to be whipped. But if the slave is not fearful of the whip, he comes ayefiyageya. He becomes tired and worn out. He doesn't try to overcome the tiredness. So then comes the necessity for reward and punishment. So the Jewish people, their main perception of their relationship with God when they left Egypt was the servant-master relationship. V'hayim Shemoah came first, and then Shema v'Yahavta came. However, later on, when Moshe Rabbeinu completed the writing of the Torah in Chumash Dvarim, in the Torah, Shema became before the V'hayim Shemoah. So perhaps that could explain the reason for Rabbeinu Tam, for the Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin, the placing of one parsha before the other. However, the Jewish people at that point saw themselves as as the servants of God, as the servants, and to a certain degree, through Moshe Rabbeinu. And so long as Moshe Rabbeinu was in their midst, in a sense, they sensed God's presence. But when Moshe Rabbeinu ceased to be in their midst, so in a sense, they began not to see God. They weren't able to sense the presence of God. It was through Moshe Rabbeinu that they were able to sense the presence of God. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Shliach Hashem, the agent and the messenger of God to them. And they thought when the messenger was there and the agent was the messenger was no longer there, the agent was no longer there, their tie to God was severed. And because of this, they went and built an Egel HaZahav. In other words, what is it? They no longer felt close to God. That closeness that happened at Mount Sinai, the experience of Sinai, was no longer there. When the experience of Sinai is no longer there, when you don't sense the presence of God, it's easy to sin. Chatasi avisi pashati lefanecha. I sinned before you. I made believe you weren't there. If I didn't make believe you weren't there, I couldn't have sinned. So not perpetuating the experience of Sinai results in non-perpetuation of the Torah itself. Now, how did God make his presence known to the Jewish people on Mount Sinai? We say it in the Muslim Shmoneh Esrei, V'kol Shofar hafata. We say in Rosh Hashanah, with the sound of the shofar, you made your presence known. The Aseres Yemei Tshuva, that concludes. The Aseres Yemei Tshuva concludes with with Yom HaKippurim. Yom HaKippurim is a day of tshuva, is a day of repentance. It's obvious. The way it manifests itself as a day of repentance is obvious. We fast, we cry, we say vidui. But Rosh Hashanah, according to the Vilna Gaon, I know the Ari disagrees. According to Vilna Gaon, you're not allowed to cry. Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva. According to the Vilna Gaon, you're not allowed to say vidui on Rosh Hashanah. Some say, according to our read, there's a short vidui that said. There's a custom to go to the river to say tashlech. Vilna Gaon also, but for other reasons says not to say tashlech. Different customs. And even then, it was only, tashlech was only a custom. For the Jews that say it, it was a very important custom. But how does Rosh Hashanah manifest itself as a day of tshuva? With the sound of the shofar. Why is it? Because a Jew who sinned, how did he come to sin? He didn't perpetuate the experience of Sinai. And when he sinned, he rejected Sinai, he rejected the Torah of Sinai. But before that, he rejected the experience of Sinai, of sensing the presence of God. So when it comes, so therefore we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah to re-undergo the experience of Sinai. Because the beginning of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, it's not enough to focus on the sins, on the violation of the Torah. But before we re-accept the Torah, we have to re-accept HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to sense his presence. And the shofar symbolizes, Uvekol shofar hafata. And the Gemara says that if a person uses gold for his shofar, it's no good. Just like when the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh Kodashim. When he went into the Kodesh Kodashim, he couldn't wear his big Bezav, his clothes of gold, because figuratively it reminds God of the Egel Hazav of the golden calf. And the Gemara asks, what's the connection? A shofar you blow everywhere. The Kodesh Kodashim was the holiest place, the most secluded place, where the presence of God was always there. And the Gemara says the shofar is kilafnail fnim. It's like being inside the Kodesh Kodashim when we blow the shofar. What does it mean? It's like being inside. But where is the presence of God strongest? In the Kodesh Kodashim, in the Holy of Holies. When we blow the shofar, it's Vikol Shofar Hafata. We re-experience revelation at Mount Sinai. And that prevents us from sinning. And the same thing is true by the ego. The Jews built a golden calf because they no longer, when Moshe was gone, they no longer sensed the presence of God. When the milieu changed, just like when the leaders of Israel, the spies, who were Kanoshim Tzaddikim, were righteous people, but they adapted themselves to be righteous within a given situation. They perhaps because of their servile attitude, they might have had some kind of excuse, not valid, that the situation changed. But for Jewish education, we have to train our children and train ourselves for changing situations. No one knows what the future will bring, but one thing we know for sure, that there are going to be changes. And to a certain degree, without getting into the question about yeshiva boys serving in the army, I don't want to get into that question now. And there are reasons why, certainly if they're not necessary, not to draft the yeshiva boys. But there are reasons that perhaps some of those that are not so, the reasons may be, we certainly have to give a lot of credit to those yeshiva boys who are Mekadesh, Shem Hashem Barabim, that are giving their lives, not only to Torah, and on behalf of Klal Yisrael. And these are we have to look up to them. And probably part of the dilemma, part of causing the problem, is because we don't give them, and the yeshivas don't give them the recognition that they deserve. And it's not just them. To recognize that they are giving their lives for them. They are saving them. In 1929, the Arabs that went into Hebron killed the yeshiva boys also. You have a debt of gratitude to them. And not just to the yeshiva boys that go serve in the army, but to all the Jews that serve in the army. Listen, many yeshivas, they make dinners in honor of their supporters, their financial supporters, many of whom do not have a Torah way of life. But we recognize, the yeshivas recognize their debt for their financial support. Recognize the debt. I'm not saying go to the army. You serve a great purpose in the Beis Medrash. But if you want them to recognize the debt that they should have towards you, you have to recognize the debt that you have towards them. Perhaps the feelings the negative feelings would not be so great. And at the same time, when the war first started, we saw such unity. We saw there were pictures on the internet when the soldiers, obviously, they were Kabul Shabbos early, and there was someone taking pictures, probably not part of their group. I don't even know if it was a Jew that did it. How all the soldiers, some even without yarmulkes, were dancing in honor of Shabbos. It was just an emotional point. Many of whom, I'm sure, never opened up a Gemara in their life. They sensed the presence of the Shekhinah when they went to battle on behalf of Klal Yisrael, on behalf of the Jewish people. And perhaps some people felt threatened by that spirituality that was uniting the religious soldiers with the non-religious soldiers. So all of a sudden, at this point, the Supreme Court issues a decree that caused havoc in Klal Yisrael, that now they have to go into the army. Now they have to be drafted. Even if you believed it, you couldn't wait till after the war. You had to destroy the unity. But they were scared that the unity was having a positive spiritual effect, even on those who up to that point were not observant openly. But even those that were not observant openly, why did they go to war? Why did they dance with the coming of Shabbos? Because there was something internal in them. And apparently there were people that were scared of that internal feeling, that internal sensing of the presence of the Shekhinah. So Dafka now, the Supreme Court, that is not limited by any constitution, they decided in the middle of the war to wage havoc, to break the unity. They put politics over the good of the state of Israel. Goes without saying, over the good of the Torah. There's a lot that both sides have to change, attitude-wise. But in any case, we have to, the idea is we have to, it's not enough if we have to experience the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it's not enough to experience HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Beis Medrash. It's not enough to experience HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the shuls. We have to experience HaKadosh Baruch Hu everywhere. And it's very interesting, the Baal Hamor, he says, it's different than all the other opinions. So the Gemara says that you need 30 kolos to miyushav, 30 kolos that are identified with sitting, and 30 kolos that are identified with getting up, with mu'umad. So the Baal Hamor says, the kolos to miyushav, he says, those are the sounds of the shofar that are sounded during the Chazaras HaShatz, when the Chazan repeats the Shemona Esrei, because his opinion was that the congregation could sit for Chazaras HaShatz. And what are the kolos, the mu'umad and Rosh Hashanah? That's just before, when we get up to leave the shul. And that's probably the basis, part of the basis. Of course, there's a Yerushalmi that gives another reason for the last kolos that we blow at the end of davening. In other words, why do we blow those kolos? What is it's the presence of God. It's not enough to sense the presence of God in the shul, in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Beis Medrash. But we have to sense the presence of God. We have to take God out with us when we leave the shul. So just before we leave the shul, according to the Baal Hamor, we have to blow the shofar. Those are the kolos, the mu'umat. And I think the custom, the Elul, there is no mitzvah of shofar. We blow the shofar because of the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, based on the custom that the Jews blew shofar in Elul to prevent them from building another golden calf. And as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah, perhaps we didn't build a golden calf, but we certainly had many blunders spiritually, many averis that we have to do tshuva for. During the Aseres you made tshuva. But it's not enough to focus on the sins themselves. We have to focus on sensing the presence of God. Because if you don't sense the presence of God constantly everywhere, we're going to recommit those same blunders. So that's why in Elul, we blow the shofar. But because the shofar represents of a kol shofar hafata, with the sound of the shofar, you made your presence known. And we want to perpetuate that experience. And especially one who sinned, in a sense, has to re-undergo the experience of Sinai, not just to recommit himself to the Torah of Sinai. So that's the idea of the sound of the shofar, lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the sound of the shofar. In Elul, we don't do it because of the mitzvah, but we do it because of the reason of shofar. And the reason of shofar is sensing the presence of God. It's kalafnayil chufnim. It's like we entered the Kodesh Kodashim, our personal Kodesh Kodashim. It's not a Kodesh Kodashim of space, as the Kodesh Kodashim was. It's the Kodesh Kodashim within us. I think Reb Chaim Volozhiner mentions in Nefesh Chaim, if my memory serves me correctly, that to a certain degree, every person is a Beis Hamikdash. And we could say, B'asli Mikdash v'shachanti b'socham. We are a Mikdash also. God dwells in our midst also. And in Elul, the blowing of the shofar, in a sense, is to re-undergo that experience of sensing the presence of God. It's not enough to sense the presence of God in shul, in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Beis Medrash, or when you're by your Rabbi or by your teacher. You have to sense it wherever you are. And that's why the Jewish people, we blow the shofar at the end of davening, even during Elul. Rosh Hashanah is a little different, but in Elul, in Lithuania, they would blow the shofar after even L'David Hashem Ori, just before they stepped out of the door of the shul. They would blow the shofar, because to show it's not that we're taking God with us. I always mention when the Churban took place, the Gemara lists all kinds of averis. Why the Churban took place? Sin is chinam. Lo bercha b'Torah tchila. So many things are listed. None of them have to do with the Beis Hamikdash itself. But the answer is, it's not that the Jews didn't want to have a relationship with God. They wanted a relationship with God. They wanted to be able to go to see God in the Beis Hamikdash, to sense his presence in the Beis Hamikdash. But when they left the Beis Hamikdash, they left God there. The walls of the Beis Hamikdash became God's prison. And God broke himself free by allowing the Romans and the Babylonians to destroy the walls of his prison. And so the idea behind the shofar is not, in Lubavitch they say that in Elul, The shofar, the Elul is Melech Basada, seeing God as king in the fields. Pesach, it's God in the, it's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, it's God in the palace, but it's in the fields. In other words, the idea is, Elul, we focus on sensing God in our daily life. Something that to a certain degree we're somewhat limited in our ability to do on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim. Because Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim is not our daily life. But Rabbi Yisrael Salanta said, every day has to be like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim. But Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim have to be better than every day. In a sense, Elul gives us a sense of the everyday, but the shofar has to give us the sense of having God as part of every day and everywhere. And in a sense, that's probably the reason for the custom, that they used to blow the shofar in Elul in the morning and in the evening, just before they left the shul. Obviously, they daven mincha and ma'ariv together like we do, as most shuls do, I should say, as most shuls do. So the custom developed that just before they left shul to blow the shofar, because the purpose of Elul is Melech Basada. It could be Melech Be'ir, it could be Melech anywhere. It's sensing the presence of God and recognizing God as our king. Basada or Be'ir, wherever we might be. And you see, in this week's Sedra, the Torah talks about the special precautions, how one has to be careful how they act in the war camp. You have to be on special guard, as the Ramban points it out, when you go out to the battlefield, because a person is more likely to sin in the battlefield. He's used to having a relationship with God in his daily life. He goes to shul, but now it's a different milieu, a different situation. So you have to be especially careful in the battlefield. The battlefield on one hand, but we saw it presents challenges, unbelievable challenges. But what we saw at the very beginning of this war, that in addition to the challenges, it showed tremendous spiritual potential. Some of it emanating from the frum soldiers, the religious soldiers, those who had to leave their base medrash to go out to the battlefield. But to a certain degree, they had that ability to bring the base medrash with them. And they inspired the other soldiers. So the battlefield represents challenges, but it also represents potential. People, when they're in danger, they begin to see the need for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And not only that, they sense that they are acting on behalf of Klal Yisrael. And when you're acting on behalf of Klal Yisrael, you're acting on behalf of Torah Yisrael also. And there was this amazing response, spiritual response. And I think that the so-called Chilonim who are not on the battlefield, the politicians, they felt threatened by the potential, the spiritual potential that was being galvanized on the battlefield. We shouldn't need a battlefield for that. But the facts were it was there. So they had to create animosity. At this point, they couldn't wait till after the war. They were ready to sacrifice the ability of the Jewish people to defend themselves against their enemies. Because of their political concerns. But we have to be on guard. And we have to do whatever we can for restoring that unity. And we have to recognize our debt to all those soldiers who are sacrificing their lives for us. And us is not just the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Of course, they're certainly included, but the Jews of Chutz La'aretz also, because we see today what happens when there's havoc in Eretz Yisrael. Jewish people in America become endangered also. It's a slower process, but it's taking place before our own eyes. And we have a responsibility to recognize the debt that we have to the soldiers in Eretz Yisrael, both the religious ones and the ones not yet observant, because they are giving their lives for us. We recognize the aid that we get, financial aid that we get for people, for our yeshivas, for our mostos and all that. We have to recognize the aid that we're getting by people who are willing to give their lives on our own behalf. And this is the Kol Shofar. The Kol Shofar is it's a sound of gathering. On one hand, it's the sound, as I mentioned before, of the presence of God, but it's also a sound of the gathering of the Jewish people. When we gather, it's when we have unity. So it's not only us sensing the presence of God, we enable all those that are part of our group to sense the presence of God. Let us hope that that unity and that sensing the presence of God, that feeling of spirituality, that closeness, that feeling of closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that was on the battlefield at the very beginning of the war will continue. And together there will be a nitzachon for Klal Yisrael. There'll be a salvation for the Jewish people and a salvation for Torah and a salvation, and it will be a victory for HaKadosh Baruch Hu as well.
Amen. Shikoach for Moshe, very powerful words of Torah. Anybody who has any questions, please leave them in the chat. Okay. It looks like there are no questions.
Okay, very good.
You've done it again.
Okay.
Open Tov, Rabbi.
I'm
Okay.
going to stop
Thank
the
you.
recording. Okay, all right.
Okay. Thank you.
Open Tov.
Good.